Welcome to Command and Control, a podcast series about military command and the control measures used to orchestrate combat engagements and wars. In this episode, we're talking about amphibious command and control, specifically from the Australian Defence Force perspective, with Ray Leggatt, a retired Commodore of the Royal Australian Navy. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
At Systematic, we make the coordination of fires simple by unifying your operational and fires missions plans into one C4 ISR management platform. The Sit-Aware Fire Support module increases your responsiveness by reducing the time between target identification and fires response, while ensuring full collaboration between all elements involved in the operation. Sit-Aware is trusted by more than 50 nations worldwide, including 17 NATO nations, and is the world leader in command and control software. Sit-Aware is trusted by more than 50 nations worldwide, including 18 NATO nations, and is the world leader in command and control software.
In many European states, the very idea of amphibious warfare has fallen out of fashion. Despite the recent uses of what's called littoral entry in Crimea, Georgia, Iraq, Yemen and even Afghanistan back in the day, the utility of amphibious forces for invasion, raids, creating dilemmas, splitting forces, demonstrations or even humanitarian and disaster relief, Europe has turned its back on amphibious capabilities. They are simply too expensive, and commanders seem to lack the imagination to see how they might be employed against Russia, the alligator closest to the European canoe. On the other side of the world, interest and investment in amphibious forces continues to grow. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, various Indo-Pacific states started to invest, train and exercise amphibious warfare. Level of excellence are hard to judge given that the full-blown exercises are rare in those theatres. Yet the growing spectre of the PLA Navy and the political ambitions of the CCP have made investment a necessity for some states. Amphibious capabilities in the Indo-Pacific are not political vanity projects, nor are they cheap. The Australian Defence Force is one such state that started to invest in the hardware a few years ago, taking possession of 2 landing ships capable of helicopter operations with docks to home and load large landing craft from, as well as taking possession of the former British landing ship Largs Bay. But with no amphibious background since World War II, the Australian Defence Force had a steep learning curve. Relying on US Marine Corps experience, bolstered by some loud voices from the UK, the Australians started to marry the hardware and the software, the doctrine, tactics, training and procedures that make up the Australian Amphibious Force. Ray Leggatt is a former Commodore of the Royal Australian Navy and found himself as the first real Commander Amphibious Task Force for Australia. I talked to him about his experiences in building an amphibious capability, warts and all. Here's our conversation. Ray, listen, welcome to the show. Thanks for sparing your time. Why don't you give me and the listeners a little bit of a background about yourself and how you came to amphibiosity and amphibious C2? Because I don't think your background is deeply in the sort of literal, right? Or is it?
No, certainly not, Peter, and thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here. But no, certainly I've not had a real strong amphibious background. I guess I would say I've had a fairly normal surface warfare career, above water warfare specialist with frigate command, shore base and training authority, maritime warfare command. And then it wasn't until I was at the 06 level that I just finished the National Defence College in India, and Deputy Chief of Navy said, what do you think about going to the Commander of the Amphibious Task Group? And to be quite honest, I really, I hadn't even read the doctrine, so it wasn't that. It was very new to me. I'd obviously been involved in things like RIMPAC exercises and embedded in US staffs, but certainly not really any sort of detail of the amphibious aspect. And then it was really quite an interesting phase. So that was mid-2011, and it was just as we were about to acquire the 2 new large amphibious platforms, the 2 LHDs, which are based on the Spanish Juan Carlos class, 28,000 tonnes, the largest ships that the Navy has ever operated, even larger than our previous carrier. And we also just acquired the ex-Largs Bay, the Bay class LSD as well. So, and before that, I don't think we really got serious about aspects of amphibious and C2. So we're on a very steep learning curve in that sort of period of time. And my staff, the whole commander of the Amphibious Task Group staff consisted of 8 people, which was, I was one of the 8. But within that 2 years, a bit over 2 years, and when I left the job, then around about October 2013, we were well over 30. And a fully integrated staff, all 3 services, plus US Marines and US Navy and Royal Marines as well. And now it's a staff of in excess of 100 with a proper CATF and CLIF capability at the 06 level. So it has come a long way. And I'd say a relatively short period of time, but we were on a very steep learning curve.
And, my first foray into amphibious warfare left me sort of bamboozled a little bit because the complexity of operating away from the deep maritime where you knew your business, you could see things clear horizon, but that operations on the seams of land, maritime, air, and of course space and data and information, all that stuff that comes with it naturally. But that requirement to operate with land forces much more closely than we'd ever done before was a bit of a culture shock, to be honest.
Yeah, and it certainly was for me. I said it was a very steep learning curve. I was very lucky that the Royal Australian Regiment was designated as to drive our initial capability was the CO of was 2 Royal Australian Regiment. And I didn't know names of Chris Smith. He's currently the current Deputy Chief of Army now. We were two very different people, but we got on very well. And I think that's a key aspect of that relationship. When we brought our staffs together, he had his sort of headquarters staff and I had mine, and we brought in others and we smashed them together, if you like, but it was our relationship. We worked very closely together and we complemented each other. We were quite different people, but we worked very, very closely together, and that was then obvious to the staff. And in a very short period of time, we integrated that staff very well. And you mentioned the complexity of planning, and yeah, it is certainly the most complex aspect. You don't get right at the very start of embarkation if you don't get that embarkation right, because you haven't got the planning and you don't have a key part of equipment getting off right at the same time, you're going to be mission failure. And I think the other challenge we had is we didn't have a Marine Force, so we had to integrate a whole range of other aspects of Army aviation, the new capabilities of the ship we never had, the docks before, and also then combining that when you're doing STORM, as we call it, which is objective manoeuvre, integrating all that sort of aspect of pre-landing force, our clearance diving capability and all those sort of aspects added a level of complexity, and you had to really go through that planning aspect. Army vehicles weren't the proper amphibious vehicles to, I think the UK standard is 2 metres, I think it is, or something like that. They can wade through 2 metres. Army didn't have those type of vehicles. So we had some challenges, but that was bringing that, and the planning was absolutely key. And we worked really hard on that planning and clearly understood then the supported and supporting relationship between the two areas for the different phases, and also what the go, no-go criteria were and what the conditions that needed to be set to go into each phase. And I think that was really key in working through those particular phases. But the relationship was absolutely the key. And I think if there was not a trust in that relationship, then you would certainly have problems.
And it strikes me that when you're pulling all these disparate facets together who've never done amphibious operations before, and this is something that Europeans have long histories in, right? So they don't necessarily understand the problems of putting them in for the first time together. It's sort of task hogging, and it's complex, and it's in a different space you're doing it for. There's a requirement in many ways to fall back on the doctrine, which again for you guys was pretty new, right? I mean, it was much based, I'm guessing, on both the British and the American experience.
Yes, it was. And I mentioned that I had quite a bit of experience with the US side embedded in their staff. But when you looked at the size of that organisation, it just didn't work for us. So then when we looked at the UK side, it was much more similar in size. So I think the advantage we had, and we had some key people from both US Marines, US Navy, Royal Marines and Royal Navy, and we had people that had come back from exchanges. We had Army helicopter pilots that had been embedded with the US Marines and those sort of aspects. So we were able to cherry pick key aspects. And you said doctrine is important, but you can't blindly follow that, and you've got to work with what works for you. And I think that's what we worked through in those periods of time. So when that first LHD then came to Australia, we had a pretty good certification process, which we went through. The first aspect was the certification, what we called the the amphibious ready element, which was based around one LHT. Up until then, we planned to certify the amphibious ready group, which is around all three ships, which was in 2017. Now, I wasn't there then, but we still achieved that for that sort of period. And then using existing exercises like the Taladin Sabre exercise we've just completed when we got all those other nations involved to go through and look at those opportunities to work through the workup process to be able to certify that capability. We had to commence a new, what we called C-series activities to work through that aspect. So I think cherry picking, the advantage we had was cherry picking the things that worked from both sides and having that experience from the US Marines, US Navy and Royal Marines and Royal Navy sort of helped us out a lot as well.
And how much of the difference is there in tactics? I mean, people talk about, it's just an extension. You're doing the same roles for deep naval assets. They'll be used to a bit of anti-submarine warfare, a bit of anti-surface warfare, maybe some gunnery, some anti-air protection. I mean, how much of those tactics and procedures did people need to really revisit, change and rethink about? Was it just adoption or was it a wholesale change of mindset?
I think it was a wholesale change of mindset because what we were doing in the past as well, we sometimes wished away the really complex bits. So because, we'd come together for short periods and there was always the focus of the movement to the objective, the assault, if you like. So we didn't appreciate that broader maritime domain or the complexity of, what happens when there's a submarine threat, what happens when there's a mine threat, those sort of aspects. So it was a much broader ADF education, I would say, from both sides. And we needed, from a Navy perspective, I became to know a lot more about the tactics in that land environment as well. So I think it was a complete, change of mindset because, as I said, we used to wish away the aspects of what we needed to do for the movement, how we were going to do the rehearsal and those sort of aspects, and what was the conditions we needed to set to be able to go into those different phases. And we really worked through a whole range of aspects of what happens when there is another threat, where we establish the amphibious operations area and we have to deal with another threat as well, like a submarine threat. And there will be periods of time when there will be a break in the logistics chains and all that sort of stuff. So again, that's that very understanding that supported and supporting arrangement and working through that aspect and building that trust. I think there was initially Army would think that we were going to drop them off and disappear over the horizon and not come back. And I think that was we had to work through. But it made us really better at understanding that very complex arrangement and all those other themes that you mentioned before. And things like establishing that amphibious operations area in terms of with our emerging capability about where could you actually exercise that C2. And then new capabilities like the supporting arms coordination cell and how we manage that with the capability we had.
I found it very difficult to relate the thinking about logistics for an amphibious operation with anything I'd done in a deep blue background in my naval career. The huge amount of thought that goes into logistics for a land force is really significant, much, much different than anything that I'd come across in a naval sphere. And I saw it much more when I started working ashore. How did this sort of manifest itself? These sort of Western powers in Europe have gone heavily for almost abrogating responsibility of logistics to a sort of joint logistics cell and taking the sort of detail out of it. You can't do that in amphibious operations, can you?
No, you can't. I think there's always the balance of what you can. And I think we still struggle with that aspect in terms of, as you say, the appetite for that, the logistic, what's required to support that operation is enormous. And again, if you get it wrong in terms of your loading or back to your planning, and to me that comes back to your planning and then your different phase and then what is the follow-on force about after that in terms of that, the logistics train as well. So it really does come into that planning aspect and the detail of how you're going to support the broader logistics aspect, and then bringing in the other, the follow-on force is key, whether that's going to be then supported by strat air and those sort of aspects as well. But you can't then have we also didn't have enough ships to be able to, with that follow-on forces aspect. So you had to work through what that next phase was and how you're going to support that from a logistics train. But I still don't think we get that right. And it's a very complex area. We still don't really understand the details of logistics. And I don't think I ever got there to the extent I needed to, but you always wanted more of it. So that was always a challenge. So I think it was Wellington that actually said that.
So you said quite early on that, this joint staff that you had, your staff building pretty quickly and then working hand in glove with the land forces formation that was with you. And commander to commander, we might come on to that a little bit towards the end, but there's a moment where the land elements of the staff step ashore, right? And your flagship suddenly loses a lot of its connection, its investment, its knowledge, its people, its experience. That sort of disappears. What does that feel like at the moment that they step ashore and sort of leave you with sort of a hollowed out staff on board?
Yeah, that was always a challenge, and it took us a while to work through that aspect as well. When there was some test and adjust about, initially it was all of Cliff staff go, and then suddenly you'd be left, as you say, with a skeleton, and you lost some very much situational awareness. So, but I think that's again test and adjust aspect of. We then got to a point where every situation is different, and we adjusted that, and then who went, and then at what phases that aspect has went. So. And I think that's going to depend very much on the operation. But we got pretty good then of understanding that. And again, that's that relationship. And I would also, I would go ashore too at different stages and engage with my counterpart to show that some of it was optics about just showing that strong relationship we had. And we worked through those sort of issues. And I think that was something we did get pretty good at about it wasn't just right when the assault happens, all of that staff go. It's different phases as you go through.
And let's talk at this stage, because you brought it up and I brought it up at the step ashore and you talked about your relationship. The CATF Cliff relationship, Commander of Landing Force, who clearly commands the shore fighting element, and the Commander of the Amphibious Task Force, CATF, they hold very different roles. And you can go back to the Falklands and you can see that there can be an ugly tension there, right? A sort of necessary tension with each believing that they hold really important facets, that relationship is really important. It doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to like people personally in order to make it work. But what's the secret between that relationship, and how do you choose that moment to swap between supported, when everyone may be afloat, and then the supporting the amphibious group? At what point is it, first people ashore, secondly, main element ashore? How does that relationship evolve?
Yeah, it is. Getting to know each other and working together over a period of time was absolutely key with that, and understanding the staff too about where their strengths and weaknesses are. I also was a firm believer of there had to be someone that is ultimately accountable. You had to make some tough decisions, and that's where I didn't like the US model from that aspect, where they were at the equal sort of level, and then if they couldn't agree on an issue, it had to go up, got kicked upstairs, which I didn't really like that model at all. And we didn't work on that model. So CATF was where the buck stopped, and if there had to be the hard decision, then that's where that hard decision was made. And that was certainly and I'm pretty sure that's still how it goes, but certainly when I was there with Chris Smith, we clearly understood that. And you talked about that supported and supporting. We put a lot of effort into that area to understand what the preconditions were, and then who would be the supported and supporting commander. And then when the situation changed, and the situation can change very, very quickly. There can be a new threat that you weren't expecting that then can quickly change that. But it's that engagement and working together, and ability, as you say, you don't particularly have to like each other, but you still got to have that trust in each other, and the trust that you're going to make sometimes some very tough decisions, but there still has to be a person, I believe, accountable for that decision.
It's certainly not something for the faint-hearted, and anyone who's done one of the amphibious operations in any role will find. I guess from a sort of European perspective, one of the biggest problems that has always existed, and I remember this in 2003, stepping ashore, was the fact that the IT systems didn't talk to each other. Like our radios didn't talk to each other. We operated on completely different bands. I mean, we couldn't tune naval radios to the army frequencies. I mean, it just wasn't possible. Besides crypto and enmeshed networks, all the stuff that happens behind it. As you were starting from scratch, did you have the flexibility to break with convention and go with one of the other systems? Did you go for something different? How did you work that idea of seamless interoperation?
Yeah, well, I don't think we're still not there yet. When you add in a range of other coalition forces, it becomes, incredibly difficult because if you don't, as you mentioned crypto, sometimes you're back into plain voice and all that sort of aspect. And then in that very complex environment of getting that situational awareness, and I said the supporting arms coordination cell and blue force tracking and all that sort of stuff. I mean, a very, very complex environment, and having that situational awareness and that clear picture was never perfect. And I don't think we've even got there now because of the complexity of that environment. Have come a long way. Before that, we were, Army would come on board and drill holes in bulkheads of ship and stick aerials out, and you'd go on the upper deck somewhere and fall over a sort of aerial. So we've come a long way since then. But, there's always that insatiable appetite for bandwidth, and you've got to, but again, it's a bit like your vehicle issue. You have to do that with your planning, and you've got to plan within your limitations, know what those are. And when it does increase, then you reassess that. So I think we've come a long way, but it's still a way to go. And I don't think we'll ever have the bandwidth you always want. A bit like, again, logistics, you always want more of that bandwidth to be able to get more of that information flow as well. And I think that's only going to be even more complex. As we get more information, it is about sorting out and getting through the chaff about what's the really important information. And I even found that when I was there some years ago now, is that sometimes you're getting far too much information, and it was difficult for them to get to what was really key to be able to make that decision.
And did you use processes like CCIRs, the Commander's Critical Information Request, that, the whole process? I mean, it's a pretty small staff, but in some way you've got to order the thinking in some ways. Did you fall back on tried and tested ways? Was there difference between the Army guys and the Navy guys in the way they wanted to plan and conduct and do the processes?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have our planning process, which we call the JMAP, and Army are quite sticklers to the JMAP, and Navy less so. And, I was a commander that would provide some guidance earlier than probably what a normal Army commander would, because I'd already made up, in some respects, my mind in terms of what some of the broad guidance I would provide. But I think the key is to use those planning aspects as a tool, not the planning process drive everything else. And again, that was that key relationship between myself and Cliff, that we understood that about each other, and we complemented each other in that aspect as well.
Interesting that you say, I mean, clearly there was trust established, a necessary precondition for amphibious operations to work. And clearly personalities worked for you and your colleague. I wonder what advice you would give to someone joining an amphibious staff fresh now from either a deep green or a deep blue background. What should they start with? A doctrine? Should they start with a good book? I mean, what is it that you think skills do they need? How do they develop those?
Well, I think it's a combination of all those aspects. The other aspect I would say is going through that certification process and practice and practice and practice. When you bring your staff together, you've got to drill them in terms of your deliberate planning, but your crisis action planning as well, which you want to be able to turn around in something like sometimes minutes, getting those core people together and drill that aspect in terms of so you can do it and you sleep. The other thing that I insisted always on is your battle rhythm it's try and keep it as simple as possible, but don't change it. So your commander's update brief always occurred at the same time. Doesn't matter if you're in a crisis or not, because that was key in terms of maintaining that battle rhythm as well. Because if you chop and change your battle rhythm, then it just increased uncertainty about what was going on. But even if there was a crisis, you still kept your battle rhythm. It mightn't last as long as a normal commander's update brief, and then just drill your team into all those sort of aspects about, okay, how you were going to deal with a crisis, what key people you wanted to come in, and getting that diversity of thought as well. And especially if you had international partners, sometimes I think we will say, oh, we know better, but if you have international partners, they've had some incredible experiences and they can look at something very differently. So giving people in your staff the voice to have their input is key to getting that diversity of thought.
Ray, I am always struck by, from what you've said, the number of challenges that there remain in amphibious warfare. And, to a unseasoned listener, they might think, well, listen, even if you don't go back to Quebec, you go back to Gallipoli, we've done enough of these operations that we should have these challenges worked out by now. What we're talking about are almost the basics. Is that because the context of each operation is different? Is it because the geography is different, the partners are different? What makes this such a difficult process for us to learn the lessons and develop? I know for Europeans, part of it is an unwillingness to learn lessons. Another part is then financial austerity, right? The prioritization of amphibiosity doesn't often reach the top of the pile.
No, and I think there's a really combination of aspects. I remember when, when we were kicking off this aspect, talking to the US Marines, and they had some sergeants that had not been embarked in a ship because of the focus was on Afghanistan and Iraq and those sort of aspects. So I think, again, and then financial pressures, the geography is incredibly important. We were lulling ourselves into a false sense of security because we're invading the same beach every single year into the same exercise. We knew the beach like a road map in Sydney type of aspect. So, and then we started to challenge ourselves in different areas further to the north where you get 9-metre tides, incredible tidal sets and all that sort of stuff, different conditions for flying, all those things. So when you add all those aspects in, and the changes of that environment can change very quickly, and I think that's exactly what you can. It's incredibly complex. One small factor can really make a huge difference, whether it's the environment, equipment going down, an unexpected threat that can pop up adds to that level of complexity. And I think that's where every situation is going to be different, whether it's a HADR mission or some sort of a strike somewhere or raid in that aspect. And it gets back to that level of planning.
Ray, listen, I was telling someone over the weekend that I was going to have a chat with you about this, and they said the one thing you should ask as a former commander of an amphibious task force, and specifically thinking about the potential for the Chinese to have a go at Taiwan, what is the area in which amphibious operations are most vulnerable? How could you unpick a PLA invasion on Taiwan in purely an amphibious terms? What's the weak point? What's the key vulnerability that you would go after that you as CATF would have gone, oh my God, that's it. The operation is done. I can do no more.
Logistics. I think, again, when you look at that, everything from the terrain, the environment, and that sort of aspect, to maintain the level of logistics I would need is enormous. And I think that would be the aspect, would be something to go after if you didn't do it before any sort of initial assault. But trying to maintain that, it would be an enormous amount of logistics. And then, again, putting that environment where you have in terms of where either from the mountainous terrain, or the beaches themselves and all that sort of stuff. It's a very complex environment there, so it would be an incredible challenge from a logistics perspective to maintain that effort.
Yeah, just you said that. I was thinking about the huge quantities that need to flow into Normandy or Gallipoli or Quebec or anywhere else. These are not small scale. You don't land a force and then leave them to crack on, right? It's the constant flow of stuff they use up. And the amount you use in combat for a land formation is astronomical amounts of everything from potable water through radios, all this stuff. I mean, it's just enormous. And it weighs a huge amount as well, right? Most of this stuff can't just go over a beach.
No. And that's the real challenging bit. So you can do that initial assault, but it's the follow-on aspects and how you support that. And then the follow-on force to be able to continue that rate of effort is quite frankly enormous. So, and very hard to maintain. And then the security of that broader ALA is incredibly complex to be able to do. And then with the supporting effort of supporting fires, it's a tough job.
And so I guess finally, Ray, I should ask you about the future. We're seeing more and more autonomous vessels. We're seeing great amounts of AI being used. We have decision support being offered by people. We have loitering drones and munitions. We have more drones all over the place, armed and ISR. I mean, what does all this bode, this sort of, what people call it another technological revolution, whether you believe in it or not, what does all this bode for amphibious warfare in your eyes?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I was just reading an article fairly recently about whether the age of a large amphibious ship is still viable. And I think that's quite a valid question as well. I still think there's always going to be a place. I mean, I mentioned HADR before. They're incredible, flexible, and I think that's the thing with amphibious aspects. The capability, we tend to focus on things like the ship, but it's really what the embarked force is. And I think you can, when you look at the flexibility of those type of platforms, it's really about whether you can embark a whole bunch of range of drones, autonomous systems and those sort of aspects, which may not necessarily be strictly amphibious, but it shows you the flexibility of those type of platforms. And then what that changes from an amphibious perspective, I think, is something that will continue to evolve. But I think that's where I see the amphibious aspect is that's an incredible flexible capability, and it's all about what the embarked force is, and it's really up from HADR type of aspects to really could be quite high-end warfighting.
Ray, an enormous pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for sparing the time. Really important for us all to understand amphibious warfare in a little bit more detail. There's no way we can reach the heady heights that you did in terms of understanding just the C2 parts of it, but fascinating to get your perspective. Thanks for sharing your time.
Pleasure, Peter. Thank you.
The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Systematic. Join your partners and allies already using our cutting-edge C4 ISR sit-aware suite.
We hope you enjoy the show. As well as telling your friends and colleagues about it, please do hit like or the subscribe buttons. The episode is produced by AureliusThinking.com as a show for the Waiver Room, the home of intellectual curiosity and challenging thinking for military professionals everywhere. Thanks for listening.